Keith, I think, however, it does really have a talent for words, and he is really kind of amazing MC. I got to kind of go back and look at the Ultramagnetic MC stuff again, because
that stuff holds up.
It does it, because I think 80s hip hop is kind of my weakness. Like, I don't really, or meaning I don't know enough about, but I want to kind of get back to that, because I kind of prefer those 80s production styles and beats lately, like old school, you know, like simple.
Mm-hmm. But one of the things that's so fascinating about when you get to that like sample based production with like a certain level of primitive tools, and the fact that the materials aren't malleable. So if you want to make something get heavier, you go and find another sample to load on top at a certain part. You can't do variation, at least in that production. That's like before, what's the one that people chop samples up with? Is that an MPC?
Yeah, MPC is kind of I think that was one of the main tools back then too, wasn't it?
Well, I think this is like pre-MPC. So like if I'm like understanding correctly, like MPCs are like what someone like whatever Jay Dilla uses to chop up samples in a fluid and organic way. The samplers that they were using in the late 80s, if you wanted to chop up the sample, you would have to sample it, then sample a piece of the sample, program that to one drum pad, sample another piece of the sample, program that to another drum pad, because it's like basically a drum machine sampler. You'd have to be kind of a lunatic to do that. So it's like, if you want during the chorus the song to get heavier or to be varied, you have to find another sample to load in, or you got to throw one on top to thicken everything up. And to me, like that rigidity is interesting, because it's like, you know, if we're playing guitar and we want to vary something, we can add a note. But with the sampler, you can't add a note. You physically need more. And there's no guarantee the more that you get is musically related. So I think like that's what's so fascinating about it. I think that's also why someone like Dr. Dre was not into sampling. He was into find the sample and then have people play the sample.
More malleable.
He could control the sound more. There could be variation. Whereas like Public Enemy, the minute they didn't need to program drum beats anymore, when they could just use samplers, they just stopped programming drum beats. They were way more interested in how can we use this thing, be handcuffed by it, and then break the handcuffs. I think that was like the creative process, was like get hemmed in by the technology and then break out of it. And I think typically what it was is people would be hemmed in with the technology and they would push against the edges of it. But with Public Enemy, it was much more extreme. Like they would do stuff like load samples in faster to get a longer sample and then slow it down on another machine. Like they had this like insane one machine to the next sort of process, because like the breaking it was the fun part. And I think like said G from Ultramagnetics, he was like hemmed in, but he wasn't interested in breaking it. He was just interested in like, okay, how do I make this work? So it's like the chorus needs variation. Let's throw another sample on top of it. Or Eric B and Rakim stuff like is the same way. Like they don't chop up samples, they just throw in another sample or a totally different one, so that it's like constantly like it's the same drum beat, their drum loop, but then there's constant different instrumentation over the drum loop.
It was always a mystery to me how hip hop records were produced, because it always seemed kind of foreign to me, or to that extent too, just all electronic based music seemed like, wow, is this made in a studio, or like, how is it? Just as a kid, I mean, and as I've gotten older, I never really took the time to understand like how hip hop records were made and the development of like sampling. So it's really interesting to hear about. I also think that like beat styles, like, I don't know, drum machine technology probably dictated a lot of how that stuff worked, but I have kind of come back down. I mean, I hate to use the term old school, but like, I feel like hip hop has kind of gone so far since then that when you go back to I'm not calling the Ultramagnetic MCs per se basic, but just that era of the 80s, that stuff almost seems refreshing and, I don't know, avant-garde sounding by comparison to some of the more like avant, like Stone hip hop.
No, I completely agree. Like there's lots of stuff that's great or that I like it, but I'm always appreciative of anything where the seams are sort of visible. So like too. Even talking about this, like, oh, it's got cable 7-inch, like hearing the thing about the guitarists and then being able to kind of see that in it is really fascinating to me. You know, and I think I told you this, I spent maybe like most of 2021 and 22 really listening to 80s rap, actually like 70s and 80s rap records. I think when you can see the seams and you can see the technological limitations, the like creative lessons you can glean from them are really sort of powerful, like especially as like a non-trained musician. The equivalent would be like as a design teacher, I showed like Swiss typography to students all the time, not because I thought it was the best stuff, but because it was so stripped down that you could explain the inner workings really easily. Yeah. And I think like if you listen to Rick Rubin productions, for example, which started out as pre-sampler, you can see, you're like, oh, okay, like, so he's got the drum machine and then he's got the turntable with the AC/DC stab. There's no economic, like he doesn't have a sampler because there were thousands and thousands of dollars at the time. Public Enemy's first record basically doesn't use samples because the samplers were so expensive and they could hold so little information that instead they had to program drum machines and hire guitarists and use turntables, not samplers, to piece things together. And so like you hear that really clearly, like in something like early Rick Rubin stuff. It's just like, okay, is a drum machine that he's like figured out the settings to like make it sound louder than life. He's not like a real DJ. He's just cutting in this one stab to make the thing. Whereas later when you get the samples, you then hear like, oh, we're not dependent on this part anymore. Like you don't have to have the DJ can be more artistic and can be like, he's not part of the beat anymore. The DJ's now making the chorus or like adding a vibe to the situation, because now you're layering all these bits and pieces, but even those are subject to your equipment problems. I don't know. Your equipment limitations. I mean, I love that stuff. There's like an urgency to it, but I think as like an artist and as an untrained musician, like listening to something like Illegal Business by Boogie Down Productions and this insane beat, but you can pick apart the pieces. So then you go like, okay, this is insane because, which to me is like the coolest part of like being able to recognize, why is this good, or why is this having an effect on me the way it is?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, I think this is like a generational thing because it probably was the same for you, but I forget which track it might be. Like, is it called like Peter Piper or something, like the Run DMC Raising Hell record production? That, as a kid, when I heard that, and I think all of us, maybe not that track specifically for everybody, but that record, the production on it, like made my hair stand on end. It was so exciting sounding. I'm reluctant to go back to Run DMC because they're so rudimentary for all of us, I feel like, but I'm curious to hear it again and see if it still has that like magic to it. But like, it's interesting to try to understand why these things are in terms of like studio limitations.
Yeah, I think it was 2022. My 3 most played songs, like when I got my Spotify thing, was Peter Piper, It's Tricky, and Rhymin' and Stealin' by the Beastie Boys. Every time we got in the car, those were the first things me and my daughter Noelle would listen to. That is interesting about it is, and this may have had to do with like, again, they're trying to make rap records, so they don't want to have like guitarists in the studio, because like a guitarist in the studio means you're not making a rap record, you're making something else. Like rap music is electronic music at its heart, right? Or it's technologically based music because it's about pre-recorded stuff, sounds.
Right.
And so having guitarists was kind of corny, or having like a saxophonist or whatever. So you're like, okay, we've got a drum machine. How do we make this sound awesome? And then your DJ cuts in the stabs or the sample or like whatever loops you might be using. But then the other thing is your vocals, every line becomes a hook. That's the thing I love about like early Run DMC or the Beastie Boys or LL Cool J. Every 4 bars is basically a hook. It's not like, and those songs half the time didn't have choruses. There was no need because
they
it
just
was
go
already
through.
16 or 32 bars of choruses, like earworms in the vocals, because, you know, they may have had to write the song before they even
For
had the
sure.
drum beat. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It'd be like, write the thing, work it out rhythmically, and then find the right drum beat for it. Whereas later hip hop becomes much more off time and sleepy and weird because musically you can just be the music can fill up the room and you can just be inspired by the music. You know what I mean? And it's easier to make the music. And I mean easier just like in terms of tools and budget and whatnot.
I think it needed to go that way for sure, but it is, I don't know enough about it to know if there's ever been much of a return or revival back to, like, I hate using the term, but old school hip hop or whatever, like production aesthetics, except for maybe like, well, maybe I shouldn't even mention it because then I'll just sound like I don't know anything. But like, I do remember like that group, the Cool Kids, like 15 years ago, having like kind of like this almost seemed like trendy. Like, I feel like they were on like a cell phone commercial or something, like just I don't know if they were like a legit group, but the beats sounded like a return to it. I guess maybe to that end too, even though it was fresh and new. I felt like this is all like really mainstream shit, but like Biggie kind of had like this, at least in the beats, just seemed really more straightforward in a time where like everything was going real jazz, like in the 90s.
Yes.
Like,
and I will say that like the genius of Sean Combs as a producer or an executive producer or whatever was that he, I think, remembered that this late 70s, early 80s rap parties, these DJs weren't digging up obscure records. You know, they were looking for the hottest part with no vocals of a hot record. Like, the goal was to make kids dance to something where they were like, oh, I didn't know that was hiding on that record, like that crazy part. And I think like Puffy realized that like you could just continue to do that, like sample the fucking Police and use the thing that was already been famous once for a good reason. And he did it when it had become cost prohibitive. That was like the other thing that made it stand out. No one does that anymore because it's expensive. You know, it's like a rich person thing to sample a famous record now. You know, I mean, the story famously goes that